If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed. What is the long-term effect of too much information?
Information, I just need some information. I've been dying. Is it lack of education? I've been reading without any transformation. I'm addicted. Is it overstimulation? Hey.
Welcome to the Sixth Sense Report.
Hear ye, come one, come all. You are listening to the Sixth Sense Report with Joel Nikoloff and Darnell Samuels.
Bro, head for the bunker, man. Are you ready to get drafted?
Nah, man. It's funny you say that. That kind of reminds me of Martin Lawrence stand-up that he did, Martin, You So Crazy, back in the 90s. And he was talking about war, and he was like, yo, I ain't the mother sucker to call. Don't call me. Don't call me. You know, so for me, I was kind of like, actually, yeah, I'm not built for that. I'd definitely be a draft dodger for sure.
Yeah. I mean, that's a no-brainer. You know, you ain't violated my rights.
Yeah. Yeah, but there's a lot of brave guys out there who volunteer and put their lives on the line for the country, and for those guys, we salute them. You know, shout to Marcus, we salute these guys. Who go out there and defend the country, you know?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I got mad respect for the people who want to voluntarily, risk their lives in that regard. But kind of playing a bit of devil's advocate to the whole concept, I saw a good meme. I don't know where it was, but something like, to the effect of, well, war should be somewhat voluntary. If the country really wants to go to war, why don't we set up a GoFundMe page and see how many people are really willing to fund that joint? Mm-hmm. As opposed to, I mean, and really the point being is, do the people of the country actually want to go to war? And how much are they really willing to spend to achieve whatever thing you want to achieve, as opposed to, the idea that like our elected representatives now, because they were elected, somehow can collectively make the right decision, the right being what the people actually want. Whereas if people are caused or people are forced to vote with their money as to how much they really want to go to war, I think that actually would be better representative. And now it would put the onus on the leaders, the politician, to actually sell to the general population why this is necessary, as opposed to giving us the propaganda to justify the actions they're already going to do. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah, well, given the circumstances of why we're doing this show, with the killing of respected Iranian military leader Qasem Solemani by the U.S. government.
I don't know if that's true. I think there's some dispute on how respected he is. But he's at least a high-ranking military official. I think he's second in command, essentially.
But he had 2 million people at his funeral. What do you mean?
Yeah, but I mean, how many people show up to the funerals in North Korea, right? Like, they show up. Do they really want to be there? I don't know, right? Like, when you've got a elected official of a tyrannical government argument, sometimes people do things because out of fear as opposed to actually out of reverence.
I don't know. I think this one's out of respect.
I mean, I didn't know about that 2 million. That sounds, to your point, that's a fair point. At least,
bro, it looked like the Raptor parade. I was just like, nah, man, this is because it's for someone sitting on the outside looking, you're like, oh, I don't know who this guy is. But then when you see the amount of people that were at the funeral, you're like, okay, this looks serious. And so we wanted to, for the listener, the direction we're going to go into with this episode is we're going to look at who is Qasem Solemani, and then we're going to look at the Iranian plane that was shot down that had 63 Canadians on it. And then we're going to look at was America justified in killing Soleimani? And then we're going to talk about Canada's role in the midst of this, because there was a meme going around that got people. So there was a meme going around that summarized how a lot of Canadians were feeling about the whole assassination. And so I'm going to play a clip from that meme, and it's from the movie The 40-Year-Old Virgin. And so Kevin Hart's in it. And so the first person you hear speaking, he represents the U.S. And then Kevin Hart's character, who responds to him, represents Iran. And then what's his character's name again?
Oh, I can never remember. It's the clip is from 40-Year-Old Virgin.
Steve Carell.
Steve Carell, yes.
Yeah, so Steve Carell, the white guy, is with the U.S., the first black guy talking.
Basically, Canada is at the end where he says, "What did I do?" That's about the only line Canada has in the skit. So
yeah, so yeah,
just for context.
So basically, yeah, they're arguing in a Best Buy type like store, and so, well, yeah, you'll hear it, and then
I'll have it in the show notes page. So
yeah, if you want to see it. So, oh, by the way, this clip has some offensive language, so if there's kids in the car,
earmuffs.
There's kids in the car. I want to skip it or lower down the volume. Sorry in advance. Here's the clip.
No, he don't need no help. He's already been served. I served him. He's taken care of. He's a little slow, but he got it. See, what he thought was he could come up in here and make the rules, but now he see that Jay make the rules in smart tech, that I run this bitch, and now he about to bounce.
This your boy?
Yeah, that's my boy, nigga. We rep the same smart tech.
You just got fucked up with him. Both y'all niggas gonna get clapped up when I get back. Both of y'all niggas.
What did I do?
It don't fucking matter.
Yeah, well, aim high, Willis. Aim high.
Please don't do this.
I want to give a shout out to Klein Solomon for that clip off of his IG page. Okay. So yeah, the what did I do is representative of how a lot of Canadians are feeling like, okay, are we going to get dragged into a World War III? Okay, so first I want to jump into a background on Qasem Solemani. This is an article from the Washington Post. In the early hours of January 3rd, 2020, the U.S. military launched a drone strike in Baghdad. It killed Major General Qasem Soleimani, a high-level Iranian military leader. The airstrike Friday morning killed not only Soleimani, but also Jamal Jafar Abrahami, an Iraqi militia commander, Abu Mahdi al-Mohandis. And so Qasem was a young man from a poor family in Iran's mountainous southeast. Soleimani joined the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a group designed to protect the new republic and enforce its strict ideological aims. Only in his 20s, he undertook missions behind enemy lines, the sort of irregular warfare that would one day become the calling card of the Quds Force. He also found allies among Iraqi's majority, the Shiite population, some of whom backed Iran against the Sunni-dominant dictatorship of Saddam Hussein. In the late 1990s, Soleimani was given control of the Quds Force, the wing of the Revolutionary Guard devoted to external affairs. The group had a lengthy history, having helped establish Hezbollah and other terrorist groups in Lebanon and in the early 1980s, and under Soleimani's watch, it expanded its influence in the region. After the U.S.-led invasion in Iraq ousted Saddam Hussein, the Quds Force began to aid Shiite militias in the country as they fought American troops. Soleimani's influence was most keenly felt in the Middle East, but his practical ambitions were not regionally bound. The Quds Force was linked to the plots in Asia and in Latin America, and even one failed 2011 attempt to assassinate Saudi Arabia's ambassador to the United States at an Italian restaurant in Georgetown. After President Trump pulled the United States out of the 2015 nuclear deal between Iran and other world powers, the Quds Force found itself at the center of repeatedly escalating tensions within the United States.
What's your opinion of this guy?
He's no joke in that he he wields a lot of power, and he's a potential threat to American safety.
Well, I mean, how, like, I would, my rebuttal to that would be, so is every military individual.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, they're put in a place where they could do good or evil, and to arguably, it's not a black and white distinction every time. So I think, the reason I bring that up is, you talked about his reverence within the country. Well, what's the origins of that? Well, so I'm on antiwar.com, which is kind of, I get there because of Scott Horton, who's the editorial director, and he's kind of my foreign affairs go-to. This guy, Scott Horton, he's a beast in terms of his research and his knowledge. So there's an article on there actually by someone else, but it was talking about, why is he so revered? And the line here is, while Trump and the U.S. often get credit in Western media for the defeat of the Islamic State, in the Middle East, the people see I can't even say his name. Soleimani as the hero of the war. So his reverence, the reason why 2 million people showed up, is because they basically give him the credence or the credit for defeating ISIS.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, if you actually look at back and Trump's tweets, he makes a point that some people have made. The biggest catalyst for why ISIS was able to exist was the U.S. presence in the Middle East, right? The regime or the regime change wars, essentially trying to build up countries by tearing them down first, created a vacuum for ISIS.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's viewed as, in essence, the biggest reason why ISIS was defeated by the Middle East, at least. So it's I think there's, when we talked about this on our Israel propaganda or apartheid episode,
mm-hmm.
about propaganda, it's like, to some extent, you got to expect whatever the government did, they're going to be selling you why they did it.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to be getting propaganda for their position.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's like similar, like we hear this line about, essentially the same article, and again, I'll have it in the show notes page. There's a section called Lies from the Trump Admin, and they talk about there's this thing going around that he's responsible for hundreds of Americans' deaths.
17,000.
And what's the line of how they draw that, right?
Right.
Because how many degrees of separation? Because arguably, is that degree of separation farther than the claim that, CBC, I think it was CBC that put out a claim, or CBC News that put out an article claiming Trump is responsible for that commercial airline getting shot down.
Mm-hmm.
Because his attack then caused unrest, then caused the military to be on high alert, which then caused the Iranian military to make a mistake and essentially shoot down a commercial aircraft in error. So, that's a few degrees of separation. And I would say, who's ultimately responsible? Clearly the Iranian military. But if I want to allow for a really liberal kind of association, I could say, yeah, the U.S. is responsible. Yeah, Trump is responsible. Mm-hmm. And so are they using that sort of, rhetoric or degrees of separation? Like, because the reason I say that is this is where things get really sticky in the Middle East. We being the U.S. actually. So the U.S. will support this guy in some scenarios, and when I say this guy, I really mean his team, his army, his military presence. We'll support them when they're fighting in one country, but then in another region we're actually attacking them. So, if you want to, again, depending on how you want to look at degrees of association, we could say that we're fighting ourselves.
I won't say that, but
no. But my point is, like, let's just let's call it Iranian army for simplicity. The Iranian army's fighting in Iraq, we're going to support them. But then in this region of Iran, we're actually fighting them.
Yeah, but that's politics. That's the nature of the business. It's supposed to be messy.
Well, but that's the nature of war. It's not really the nature of, like, how do you have a military allegiance with the same group of people depending on where they're fighting?
Because that's politics, man.
Well,
I don't like, for me, I don't try to apply reason to why these guys do things. I really don't. Like,
Okay.
my bottom line is, look, if this guy's I'm not, like, what do I do with my life? What do? I play basketball. I do a podcast. I hang out with my wife. I train kids in basketball. I read books. That's what I do. Some of us play video games. Some of us do a whole bunch of other things. Politicians are paid to do politician stuff, where they get their hands dirty and they do stuff that maybe I don't want to know about it. But the bottom line is, they're supposed to be there to protect me from any potential danger. Whether you get your hands dirty like Designated Survivor or House of Cards or you name it, these guys just get their hands dirty. That's what they do. I don't try to apply a logic to why they do these things. The bottom line is their ultimate agenda should be to protect the safety of their people. And sorry, I know you mentioned the airplane situation, and I just want to quickly clarify that for those people who weren't quite sure where the connection is. So in Ottawa, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and this is an article from the National Post, and so Prime Minister Justin Trudeau addressed the nation Thursday afternoon amid multiple reports pointing their finger at Iran for the downing of a Ukraine International Airlines flight. The crash killed all on board, including 63 Canadians and 138 who were headed to Canada. Addressing assembled media in Ottawa, Trudeau said, Canada has intelligence that indicates the plane was shot down by an Iranian missile. So he says, we have intelligence from multiple sources, including our allies and our own intelligence. The intelligence indicates that the plane was shot down by an Iranian surface-to-air missile. This may well have been unintentional, he said. When Trudeau was asked whether he was not ruling out that this was intentional, the Prime Minister said, it is really too early to draw any conclusions. Asked if the downing could be seen as an act of war, Trudeau said, it is too early to draw definitive conclusions like that one. That is why we need a complete and credible investigation. Sad situation, man.
Well, yeah, it's you know, and I have I use an app a lot of times called News Voice. I think they recently got bought by Google, which is kind of disturbing. But what I like about it is generally they give you kind of a summary headline, and then they'll give you a number of articles kind of going both ways and telling you, oh, this source is generally left-leaning, this is right-leaning, this is central. And so, bring that up to say, I saw the headline there, and it seemed like everybody from both sides of the spectrum were ruling this as, the initial responses or initial thoughts from, it seems like everybody involved, was that it was accidental in nature, meaning there wasn't they intended to shoot the plane down. They didn't intend to shoot down a commercial airline. And so I actually recently posted something on Facebook that was a BBC article that said, it was titled, "When the U.S. Shot Down an Iranian Airliner." And this was on July 3rd, 1988, a sophisticated U.S. Navy warship shot down an Iranian civilian airliner flying over the Persian Gulf. All 290 aboard the aircraft were killed. So now what's interesting is somebody commented and said the U.S. paid Iran $64 million to the families. And his response was, let's see if Iran does the same.
But now, with this, in light of this situation, it does raise the question about, just war versus pacifism.
Well, and I would say, I think, you said the word pacifism, and I think another word that's thrown out there a lot of times for, let's say, people like me I don't want to say demonized, but they get put in we get put in a box of isolationism.
Okay.
Right? I would say that's probably similar to what people think of when they think of pacifism.
Hold on, is it the same?
Well, I don't know. I think isolationism is a straw man.
Okay.
To be honest.
Okay, so let me go through the definition of these things, and then you can be like,
We'll go
okay, well,
from
this
there.
works. Okay, just war theory is a theory that was created by Christian theologians. Just to put that out there.
Contextualize.
Yeah, to contextualize, and also, so I'll also add some Bible verses to it, so you can kind of think them through or write them down as you're listening. Just cause is the reason for going to war, a morally right cause, such as defense of a nation, Revelation chapter 19, verse 11. And then the point 2 is competent authority. Has the war been declared not simply by a renegade band within a nation, but by a recognized competent authority within the nation? Romans 13:1. Point 3, comparative justice. Is it clear that the actions of the enemy are morally wrong, and the motives and actions of one's own nation in going to war are in comparison morally right? Romans 13:3. Point 4, right intention. Is the purpose of going to war to protect justice and righteousness rather than simply to rob and pillage and destroy another nation? Proverbs 21, verse 2. And then point 5, last resort. Have all other reasonable means of resolving the conflict been exhausted? Matthew chapter 5, verse 9, and Romans 12, verse 18. Point 6, probability of success. Is there a reasonable expectation that the war can be won? Luke 14, verse 31. Proportionality of projected results. Will the good results that come from a victory in a war be significantly greater than the harm and loss that will inevitably come with pursuing the war? Romans chapter 12, verse 21, and then 13, verse 4. And then finally, point 8, right spirit. Is the war undertaken with great reluctance and sorrow at the harm that will come rather than simply with a delight in war, as we see in Psalm 68, verse 30.
So, if I was to try to summarize, I think, and maybe I I don't want to misrepresent that kind of that kind of principle approach, but it sounds almost like I think 7 out of the 8 of them are really about morality, motives, and intentions. And I think it was the 7th one that is really about, I'm actually going to take it to economics, but really it's about, weighing the cost benefits.
Mm-hmm. Well, even when you talk about like the heart and the sentiment and the intention, it reflects like St. Augustine's theories and the man who...
what I'm trying to get at though is like you laid out. I think you got to number 8, right? So you're talking about the eight principles, and I would say 7 of them are challenging the morality of it. Just is it moral, right? Do you have the right intentions? Do you have are all the aspects of going to war moral? But then one of them, I think it was the 7th one, is everything could be moral, but if the amount of damage you're going to inflict is just astronomically high, well, then that supersedes, in essence, having all the right motives, right? Like mutually insured destruction would not be a good course of action, no matter how moral it is, right?
I wouldn't say right necessarily.
Well, Okay, so if the like, and so this is where I'll use two extremes to kind of paint the picture I'm trying to get at is, if you know that a particular action will lead to nuclear destruction of the pretty much the entire world.
Okay, well, okay. Can you kind of pick something a little bit?
Well, no. Okay,
more
so
practical.
my point, but I use hyperbole to kind of paint the picture that that's what number 7 is saying, that like the costs have to be appropriate to the benefits, right? So if the benefit is to prevent, let's say a Hitler, but the cost is nuclear war across the world, is that like the point is?
Your example is gonna have to be a little bit more realistic for me because
I'm using an unrealistic example to actually demonstrate
my mind
that would say
my mind doesn't go to unrealistic places, man.
Okay, but okay, fair enough.
Okay,
but
okay.
the question is,
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I know we're kind of getting into a bit of
no, it's okay
back
because
and forth here,
but I wanted to get to the pacifism.
Okay, but just I want to like hammer home a point here and that is about just war theory, and this is why it's important, because I found I actually really appreciate the fact that you're just war theory considers the impact as much as all of your motives could be in the right place, all of the intentions, all of the goals could be correct, but if the course of action you're going to pursue will result in astronomically high costs, then it is not just. Right? It's kind of like the principle within Canada, we have this that you have to use reasonable force to defend yourself. Right? Like if you shoot a guy who's 6 times, who came to your door, looking to beat you up with his fists, arguably you could potentially charged with manslaughter in Canada, even though you might claim it's self-defense, but it's unproportional violence, if that's the right. So I'm saying that's kind of how they're, at least to me, they're kind of incorporating that into this just war theory. So I just think for the listener, I thought it was important to kind of hammer home that point that's actually for all of the principles that you laid out, that one is unique almost, or it's different in its nature. Mm-hmm. So, and I thought it was important. So, anyways, okay. So moving on to pacifism.
Okay, so pacifism. So the arguments commonly used to support pacifism are that 1, Jesus commanded us to turn the other cheek, Matthew chapter 5, verse 39. And point 2, Jesus commanded us to love our neighbors as ourselves, Matthew chapter 22, verse 39. Point 3, engaging in military combat involves failure to trust God. Point 4, we should depend on international law rather than going to war. Point 5, the use of violence always leads to further violence, and pacifism should be adopted to stop the vicious cycle. And this was taken out of the book Christian Ethics: An Introduction to Biblical Moral Reasoning by Wayne Grudem.
And for the the Bible heads, for the most part, I think pacifism is highly associated with the Anabaptists. I know that's kind of their default stance almost in general, both on let's say more so on a personal level. So think of pacifism in your personal scenario of essentially sacrificing your life versus killing someone in self-defense.
So would you say that these views line up with like you being called an isolationist?
I think the isolationism would be. I think when people use the term isolationist, it's a straw man. It doesn't fairly represent. I think just war theory that you laid out more so represents what people demonize or is very similar to what people are demonizing when they're calling people isolationists. So someone like Ron Paul was called an isolationist because he's
who's Ron Paul, for those who don't know?
Ron Paul essentially is I'll call him a hardcore libertarian who was a Republican senator for many years, non-compromising in so many regards. In that, I mean, in politics, there's so much like, I'll scratch your back, you scratch my back. What do I got to do to get you to vote yes on my bill? And Ron Paul was purely principled. Like, is this bill infringing on people's liberties? Is it against the Constitution? And that's how I'm voting. And so he didn't, I've heard a few people from his office. He's retired. Essentially, he tried to run for president in 2008 and 2012. And I think shortly thereafter, he retired. And he has now, it's called the Ron Paul Liberty Report. He's got a couple different like podcasts. I think it's called the Ron Paul.
Well, he has his own curriculum through Tom Woods.
Oh, yeah. Tom Woods. Essentially, there's a Ron Paul homeschool program, self-taught homeschooling program. So, for any listeners out there who are homeschoolers, apparently his program is killer in that regard. That obviously it's probably not for a grade 1 or grade 1 to be self-teaching themselves, if that's the right way of saying it. So it's probably a little bit more.
So about the
isolationist
isolationist thing, yeah.
So Ron Paul being probably the one that gets demonized the most, he basically put the challenge out there that the fact that U.S. has military bases all over the world, the fact that they have a military presence in countries, arguably, and I think this is a fair argument, or at least an argument that needs to be entertained, and that's why he gets strawmanned. So the argument is that by being militarily present in a country is what's causing them to hate you. So when we hear of 9/11, the argument was they hate you for your freedom, and his answer is no, they hate us because we're over there doing military exercises all the time. And whether you agree with him or not, I think the challenge that he's proposing is something that actually needs to be engaged with. But demonizing him as an isolationist is how you avoid actually engaging those type of arguments that, Team America World Police is creating more havoc than saving people. So going back to your question, I think the proper perspective of Ron Paul would be he's not against going to war. He's pro only just war. And he would say, okay, it needs to be an act of Congress, and that's a more constitutional approach. Without getting down the rabbit hole, there is a War Powers Act that is more about single attacks, but I think it gets abused. Anyways, all that to say that I think the just war theory, as a principle, without getting into the specifics of, is this a good aspect of it or bad, the principle behind it, the goal of saying war is just in very limited circumstances. Here's the criteria that we're trying to lay out, in this case, a biblical standard. But I would say even I would be happy as a Christian even to see, let's say the U.S. Even coming up with their own kind of principles for just war. Because right now we just have military presence that is, in my opinion, excessively and immoral because we're violating, other countries, we're violating people's rights. We in essence don't have jurisdiction to do a regime change war, to do nation building. There's really no justification other than, we don't, the front is that we don't think that those countries are democratic enough, and so we're going to basically do nation building and help set up a democracy. But I would say if you look at everything they've done since 2002, post 9/11, in essence, if you're really judging it fairly, it's an absolute failure, i.e., primary example being ISIS. Or the Islamic State rising that we've previously touched on.
Mm-hmm. So then would you say that, so then you would disagree that the U.S. was justified in the killing of Soleimani?
Yeah, I mean, I would challenge on a number of different reasons. But yeah, I would challenge that it was just. At the same time, I can, let's say we look back and say, okay, everything, the entire, I would just say Trump inherited a mess from Bush and Obama. Those two did more, if not the same. Whether, if you want to get into specific quantities, like it's you're comparing apples and oranges when you start talking 5-10 years later. But
sorry, but how was the U.S. unjustified in killing him?
I mean, for me, I would say that you've essentially started a war because if you had said that he was in the process of if he was in the process of
the grounds
initiating
the grounds is preemptive strike. For those who don't know, preemptive strike is you think that or not you think or you have information that you're in harm's way or they're plotting something against you, then you can get at them before they get at you.
Yeah, so I mean that to me, I would say that any sort of claim of such is hot garbage. There's really no evidence. Essentially the evidence is razor thin. I'm stealing that from that anti-war post that I referenced earlier. Do your own research, and I think you'll find the same thing, that really killing him in essence in self-defense is hot garbage. But if that's where I would say, if you could substantiate that you were killing him in self-defense, then I would, have a self-defense argument. Then I would say, okay, the morality of it's a little bit different because now you're really in war, right? You're talking about they're going to attack us, so we got to attack them.
But what if they? So help me. So in your theory, are you saying that they have to attack us first?
No, I think you said it right. If there's an imminent attack, self-defense. But unless you can prove there's an imminent attack,
but what do you
it's
mean
not
by
self-defense.
But this goes back to my first point. First of all, that's the government, and so some of the stuff they do, have to be behind the curtain. And so, they're not gonna come and give you a whole layout of all their top secret information. I'm sure there's some stuff they just gotta keep close to the chest.
Well, and this is where I don't disagree, sorry, it's not that I don't disagree. I agree that there's a deep conversation there around how do you protect the military's ability to do what they need to do while holding them accountable to a just standard. Right? That's a deep conversation. I'm not trying to get into it, but to some extent, the response to what you're saying is I agree that it shouldn't necessarily be on public display, but in a scenario like this, should there be checks and balances to essentially pass judgment when the let's call it the appropriate standard for determining an imminent attack is not actually there. Now,
but hold on, man. But all that's relative, man. It's all relative. Whether the information you get isn't enough, or it's too much, or whatever the case is, all that stuff is relative.
Well, okay, so and I think when you say relative, it's kind of what you're saying is that
it's never enough. It'll never be enough. It'll never be good enough.
There's a difference between having bad information and making the wrong, making a judgment based on bad information, as opposed to not actually they're claiming self-defense. They're claiming there was an imminent attack. Mm-hmm. But if that's just propaganda,
and he has a track record.
Yeah, right. So, but they're again, this is propaganda, and to some extent, they're justifying. There's a public justification, right? So, why do they tell us he's a bad guy? To justify the fact that killing him was appropriate, right? They're not going to tell you he's a wonderful human being, but he's on the other side, so we had to kill him.
Well, why would they kill a wonderful human being?
But my point is that when it comes to love and war, all is fair game, right? So, I mean, I'm being a little bit, ironic there, or ironic's not the right word, but you get my point. I'm trying to say that it's not as simple as, well, they said he was a bad guy, so therefore, and that's why I said to you, like, saying he's responsible for killing hundreds, essentially, I think you said 1,700. I mean, it's a tough thing to say, because I go back to what I said at the beginning. We support him when he's fighting the wars we want, but then when he starts doing things we don't want, we start attacking him.
Well, yeah, because part of it is somebody has to bear the responsibility of making these big time decisions. And that's why I said, like, yo, all I do is eat, hang out with my wife, and play basketball and do yoga.
So, I mean,
that's
as
it.
a Christian, and my perspective with regards to war, or with regards to government and God's sovereignty, is like, okay, yeah, I would agree with you that, like, okay, I trust God with these things, and that's in his hand, and that's in his place to judge. But if I had influence on how government operates, I'm going to say, war is a last-ditch effort, right? And war is something that happens and then is done. It isn't a 20-year war, because that's not 20-year war. That's called occupation.
Yeah. Yeah, well, either way, I would just say, like, look, man, protect me. Whatever you got to do, protect me. Protect me. That's what I'm concerned with.
And I think this is where the pacifism, kind of like argument, as opposed to just war, the rebuttal on the pacifist side is, is your life worth more than the others? And if you're going to heaven, why are you, willing to kill that person to save your life?
Yeah, no. Well, again,
I'm not necessarily holding that position. I'm
Yeah.
saying that's the pacifist.
yeah, no. But I think, again, like, at the level where, governments and militaries are at war, that's on another level that, like I said, my regular day doesn't consist of that. But, those guys are in leadership for a reason. One, because, the people have made their choice, and one, God has made his choice. And I believe all those things come together to work for good. But I also wanted to touch on, like, the Canadian aspect. Okay, so I'm going to read an article from NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and read the article about their collective defense. So the collective defense clause, it's Article 5, and it says that an attack against one ally is considered as an attack against all allies. So by default, Canada is brought into this mess. Kind of like, I think about the Mac 10. So for anybody who doesn't know who Mac 10 is, a rapper, is part of West Side Connection back in the 90s. And so he was talking about something he was taught by his dad. And his dad always taught him, whether the crew you're rolling with, whether they're right or wrong, you always got to roll with them. Right? So in a sense, like, yeah, sometimes it's just like, you're forced into a situation where, look, man, whether you're right or wrong, you got to roll with them. And it is what it is. For Canadians, it's like, because part of it too is like, we do business with the U.S. We're on the same piece of, land as they are. We're right next door to them. It is what it is. I think with the whole airplane situation, as we say around these parts, that's a beef ting.
Why do you say that?
We had our people on the plane, and I felt like it was personal. If you have a plate of food, and I turn around and I reach to, scratch my head and I accidentally slap your plate of food out of your hand, and that was an accident. I'll buy you a new plate. I'll buy you a new shawarma. Accidentally pushing a button to take down a plane with people on it, especially our people. No, I'm not cool with that. And like, and like, kind of like what Trudeau said. And Trudeau was trying to, of course, try to be, politically savvy and not say anything too crazy in that press conference. But yeah, they have intel that, yeah, it was Iranian missiles that did it. And, he doesn't want to say anything that's going to get people riled up. But like, that you don't shoot down planes by mistake.
Well, I mean, that's the whole going back to the U.S. one, right, where I quoted that BBC article. They did it. So apparently this is a thing. So yes, this morning actually I was talking to some men at my church, and they were talking about the Russians actually had a problem with this in the past. Something to do with like basically military radar historically. This is what the Russians' problem was, that they didn't have the ability to differentiate between military and commercial airlines or flights. And then I kind of jokingly was like, "Oh, that's all the stuff that Iran has now. It's all from Russia's secondhand stuff." And so I did hear that though that was one of the issues with Iran, that they didn't have the ability to decipher with their anti aircraft radar, if you want to call it that. That basically. So they again, I mean, if you look at the flight, there's a whole bunch of funky stuff, right? Like this flight was delayed over and over again for mechanical stuff, and then finally it took off and it was blown up in the air, which is like kind of a random sequence of events, if you want to call it that.
I don't know. I can't call that random, man. And
well,
that's what
I mean. I get that it's a reason to be hesitant to accept it. But I would say, there was more Iranians on the plane that they shot down than Canadians.
Yeah, but the plane was coming to Canada, I believe.
No. So the plane was flying from Tehran to Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
It was a Ukrainian airliner.
Yeah.
Sorry, Ukrainian airliner. I think they originally said there were 63 Canadians, but they've lowered the number to like 57 because I'm guessing those 6 people were actually people in Canada who aren't classified as Canadians. Think of like a student on a visa for school. They're technically still whatever other nationality.
Yep.
They're not Canadian.
Yep.
So anyways, all that to say, but I think the total was like 170 or 180 people that got killed. And so we're talking roughly 100, let's say, just for simplicity, 100 Iranians are on the plane.
Yeah,
so,
but I think, because it says here in the National Post article that the plane was headed to Canada.
Yeah, I think...
Okay, so let me put it this way. I'm in Europe, and I'm flying to Canada.
Mm-hmm. I don't think it was a direct flight is kind of what I was trying to get at. But yeah, I think they were heading to Canada. That's why there were so many Canadians on the flight. But
okay, yeah. But I mean, whether you're coming from Jamaica, Trinidad, or wherever, and there's an idea, there's this concept now where people are shooting down planes headed to our country. I don't think that's good for business, and I don't think that's good for civil morale of the country. So it's just one of those things. I'm just like, look, man. That's grounds for, I'm not gonna say war just yet, but it's definitely grounds for leaning towards that way, because like you talked about things being done by mistake. If the US killed this guy by mistake with this drone strike, like that's not a mistake. Shooting people down with missiles or drones or whatever the case may be. Now, mind you, Soleimani was in Iraq, which is what Baghdad is in Iraq, and that's where Soleimani was killed, and that was U.S. jurisdiction. So U.S. Has jurisdiction to execute
in Iraq.
In Iraq.
Wow, how do they get such jurisdiction?
Well,
I mean,
no, yeah,
that's not America.
Yeah, no.
How do they have jurisdiction?
No, but
not
I
in
don't
America?
care. I don't care how they got the jurisdiction. You kick the people out that you don't want there. Now you now you run the place. What do you mean?
Wait, it just violated property rights.
Yeah, well, now it's my property. So
yeah,
if you come into here,
there's
going to be a problem. But my point is this: look, it is what it is. Like I can go to Trump and tell him, hey, look, man, what you did was immoral. But the next day, the situation is still the same.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If some thugs come and take over my home, I can't come back into my home because there's thugs in there. They're running it now. It is what it is. Unless I come back with a bigger crew and I kick those guys out. It is what it is. So all I was just saying was just like, yeah, he got killed in that territory, which the U.S. was policing, and it is what it is. And I'm sure he knew.
Yeah.
I'm sure he knows. It's kind of like blood's going into crypt territory. Wagwan.
Yeah.
I heard
heard-
your car gets shot up. Well, yeah, you in the wrong neighborhood, bro.
I can't remember where I heard this, and it's going to suck because I won't be able to put it in the show notes page, and I always hate kind of quoting stuff that I can't. But I did hear something to the effect of, like, he was traveling to negotiate with Saudi Arabia with regards to kind of stand down stuff. So part of his movement to getting to where he was, I don't want to say peace treaty, but to some extent it was, negotiations. And so, I mean, if I want to put my conspiracy hat on, to some extent, Saudi Arabia lured him such that the U.S. could actually carry out this attack.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because I think I try not to go into the conspiracy thing because sometimes I feel
and that's where it's like, I always make this quote on the show, right? Why do conspiracy theorists get a bad name? Because they're filling in details. So yeah, I'm filling in a bit of details. I don't quite remember where I heard it, but when I heard it, I was like, because what's crazy. And this is where I was going to kind of say this to the end, but it's a good time, and we're kind of starting to wrap
okay.
up.
Well, what's your 2 cents, and you can.
Okay, so we haven't even touched this topic, but kind of what blows my mind on this is, do you know how many people died in the U.S.'s attack?
Sorry, which attack?
So the drone strike on Soleimani.
Oh no, how many?
2.
Mm-hmm.
Which is good and crazy at the same time. And the reason I say it's crazy is it wasn't that long ago Obama was taking so much heat for the, let's call it, civilian casualties that were happening under his drone strikes.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, Obama's basically like the drone strike leader. Now, I think Trump has kind of maybe had more quantity of drone strikes, let's say per year, per capita kind of, way of looking at it. But if you look at the casualties, Obama was racking up like collateral damage in a sense. They didn't have, and this is why I said it's kind of crazy. This is what's kind of, when I reflect on the whole thing, that's kind of scary, is that, the ability now to be so precise in drone strikes, such that you don't have collateral damage. And yes, right now we're talking about this being in a third world country, or in a foreign country, I should say. To us, it's not on home soil. But if you think of, poor progression of a tyrannical government, do we start getting into this idea of like pre-crime and being able to detain people? And so, yeah, I mean, to some extent, I know I'm going total sidebar, total off the rocker with my point, but it just, reflecting on this, going from crazy amount of people that would die under drone attacks to now having such level of precision to literally just kill 2 people, which to some extent is good. It's just forward looking or kind of thinking, how can this be used for bad? Or putting it into a quote that I'm sure many people have heard, with great power comes great responsibility. And I think this is why, when I look at the level of power that the government has, I challenge and say the just war theory, and having appropriate standards and controls in place such that, attacks like this are only occurring when you have, let's say, the proper levels of control approving it or validating what needs to happen.
Mm-hmm.
What about you? What's your 2 cents when you reflect on this whole thing that just went down?
Donald Trump has this ability, or the polarizing political power of the Trump can be distracting. So I think it's important for Christians to get back to principles. And when we look at the principles of the just war theory, we look at St. Thomas Aquinas expounding on St. Augustine's reflections on the principles of the just war theory. And that's what we're using today. So, we can kind of, thank the early church fathers for helping us not just contemplate, our heavenly citizenship, but also our earthly citizenship. So the need for Christians to consider sound, justification for going to war is crucial. So I think it's important that we consider, be careful of the propaganda, like you said, and be able to go back to the scriptures. Because Jesus said, I didn't just come to bring peace, but he came to bring a sword. Right? So whether war on a personal level or a military level, we must not forget that, fighting is something we try to avoid, but sometimes have to do to maintain the peace.
The idea of maintaining the peace, I think, is something we don't engage enough, right? And that's where, my position on all this, generally speaking, is anti-war, because I think we too easily accept the war because it's not on home soil, right? Like, what if this was, in our backyard, right? What if Alaska was the country we're talking about? And it's, right next door to us. Would we feel differently about this? What if it was, what if you as an individual had family in that country that this is going down and you have to worry about, your family being collateral damage? Does that change how you evaluate it? And if it does, I would say that's because you're not taking a principled approach. If you're taking a principled approach, the context of how it affects you personally doesn't matter. So, I mean, that's where, for the most part, I'm trying to just, I feel so many people in the, Middle East wars are just like, well, those people are evil, so we need to fight them. Or, they don't have the level of enlightenment that us in our civilized democracies have. And there's this snobbery looking down on them that I think is unfortunate. So that's my 2 cents. I think we've hit it home pretty good that this is a tough one.
And I'm sure there's going to be more information coming out in the weeks to come. And, hopefully, we didn't speak too heavy-handedly because, again, we don't have all the information. And it'll come out in the days to come. And maybe we have to come back and revisit this episode. But please let us know what you guys think. You can contact us by email.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll try to put, as much as I can in the show notes page with respect to, let's say, a little bit of differing opinions. I know we spoke to, why we thought, or at least I spoke a little bit to why I thought the Iranians were positive towards him. But I got a couple YouTube videos that are kind of on the other side of it, why Iranians didn't like this guy. So I think you raised a good point that there's a lot of information. I'm sure more and more is going to continue to come out. And potentially, let's say, it might be 15 years from now, we really get a good picture of how imminent the danger was that the Trump administration was claiming.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if you're trying to get in contact with me, you can contact me on Twitter, Duga to Darnell, DOGUDDA_Darnell. That's on Twitter, and on Instagram, Facebook, it's Darnell Samuels.
And Joel Nikoloff, Joel N39 everywhere. And hit us up, 6 Cents Report, 6centsreport@gmail.com. Let us know your 2 cents.
6 cents makes change.
But you heard me? Does that make sense?